Hello everyone, welcome back. I am Kris. This is part 2, Timur and the Timurid Empire. This is the people profiles. I've done a couple other videos before. Love the channel. If you can click that thumbs up, bare minimum please. Subscribe to the channel if you like the content. Click on the thanks button if you want to sponsor a video, donate to the channel, whatever. Much appreciated. Another 17-minute video. I had to go back a little bit, just 1 second. Now.
He would rule over an ever-growing confederacy from Samarkand over the next 35 years. Timur was very anxious to legitimize his rule after he secured firm control over the lands around Uzbekistan, northern Afghanistan, Tajikistan, and eastern Turkmenistan in 1370. For any would-be Turkic-Mongol ruler in this region in the 14th century, the easiest way to do so was to establish that he was a descendant of Genghis Khan, and thus a legitimate successor to a part of his empire. At first, Timur took the unusual step of establishing a recognized descendant of Genghis, Sayur Khatmish, as the actual Chagatai Khan, affirming himself to simply be the chief general and administrator of the Khanate. This was just a temporary expedient. At the same time, he married the widow of his former rival Hussein, a woman named Sareh Mulk Hanum, who was also descended from Genghis. Through this marriage, he claimed the title of Temur Gurgan, one which had been held by Genghis's sons-in-law back in the early 13th century. There were also fanciful efforts made in the years that followed to argue that Timur was directly descended himself from Genghis. Through these means, he established the notion over time that he was a descendant of the great Khan both by right of marriage and by blood. Sayur Khatmish was eventually dispensed with, and Timur affirmed his position as emperor in his own right. On top of this, he was conscious of the need to declare his credentials as an Islamic ruler, something Genghis had never had to contend with. His position as a Turkic-Mongol leader in Central Asia precluded him from adopting any of the titles that the followers of the Prophet Muhammad had held amongst the Arab leaders of the Caliphate in the Middle East hundreds of years earlier. Instead, he proclaimed himself to be the Sword of Islam, a religious warlord as well as a Mongol leader. This title would become paradoxical over time. Timur was tolerant of Hindus, Jews, and Christians within his realms. Instead, the Sword of Islam was directed against fellow Muslims, specifically Shia Muslims, as Timur, at least nominally, proclaimed himself to be a Sunni Muslim, though the depth of his religious belief is questionable. For any ruler who establishes a new dynasty in the way which Timur did, securing the succession is almost as important as seizing power in the first place. Timur had no problems in this regard. Throughout his reign, the number of possible successors grew and grew in line with his list of wives. Polygamy was standard among Mongol rulers. In Timur's case, he had married for the first time when he was still in his teens, and his eldest children, 2 sons named Jahangir and Omar Shaikh, were born between 1355 and 1357. As we have seen, he married the sister of his erstwhile ally Hussein at the start of the 1360s, and then his widow a decade later. After he rose to power, he began accumulating wives at a steady rate. Some of them are mentioned briefly in the chronicles, and then disappear from the record again just as quickly. Most were the daughters of local rulers of regions that Timur conquered, the marriages being for the purposes of cementing political alliances and Timurid rule. An account by a European traveller to Samarkand in 1404 relates that Timur had 8 wives at that time, though some died over the years, and it seems fairly safe to assume that Timur had at least a dozen wives over the course of his lifetime. Amongst these, Sarai Mulk Hanum, Hussein's widow, was his chief wife, the recognized great queen of the empire. There were clear motives for her promotion, as Saray was a descendant of Genghis Khan and a princess of Mogulistan, the name for the region where Transoxiana and Mongolia proper meet in the plains immediately north of the Himalayas. These unions resulted in dozens of children. Moreover, because he had children quite young, and they in turn started their own large families, by the latter stages of his reign, large parts of Timur's empire were ruled over by his sprawling cohort of sons and grandsons. It is no surprise that this situation would lead to a succession dispute when Timur died. While Timur was consolidating his rule in Samarkand,
if he had too many lines of succession, they were bound to, as soon as he died, to disregard it because, well, I have just as much right. I am in the line. If you just have one and you're like, that's it, this is the person, it's a lot easier. Of course, that's the person everyone wants to kill then.
the political and military environment to the west was shifting. North of the Caspian Sea, the Golden Horde had been the dominant power all the way from the Black Sea to the Ural Mountains and south towards the Chagatai Khanate for a century. Like the Chagatai Khanate, this confederacy of Mongol groups was declining in the 14th century through internal power disputes, and because the Russian principalities up the river Volga towards the cities of Novgorod and Muscovy were strengthening. In 1380, Grand Prince Dmitry of the Duchy of Muscovy inflicted a major defeat on the Golden Horde at the Battle of Kulikovo. Further west, the Poles and other Christian states were also beginning to reassert themselves against the Mongols on their borders.
That's just a nice, that's a beautiful little area. Sorry, it's weird. The older you get, things like this, you're kind of like, oh, that's really nice. Probably somebody will be like, oh, that's such and such location. That's where a lot of people get mauled to death by bears. Cool. Yep. That's what I needed to hear.
States were also beginning to reassert themselves against the Mongols on their borders. To the south, the Ilkhanate that had ruled as a Mongol state over the northern end of the Middle East, the South Caucasus and into Persia, had collapsed quite quickly in the middle of the 14th century. Various new powers had risen to take its place, notably the White Sheep Turkmen, or Ak Koyunlu, in Persia, and much of what is now Iraq, and the Black Sheep Turkmen, or Kara Koyunlu, in eastern Turkey and the South Caucasus. Further west again, the first stirrings of what would become the Ottoman Empire were occurring in western Turkey, while a new dynasty, the Burji, claimed power in the Mamluk Sultanate, which ruled Egypt and the Levant. All of these powers were fighting one another, while there were further difficulties in these regions being wrought by the spread of the bubonic plague. Generally speaking, the world to the west of Timurid's emerging empire was filled with unstable powers that were at war with one another, a situation which held out the possibility of an outsider moving in to conquer the region if he brought the right army to bear in doing so. As early as 1372, when his rule over Samarkand and much of what had been the Chagatai Khanate was barely just in place, Timur set off west with his forces to begin expanding at the expense of these unstable powers of Western Asia. His first target was the Sufi dynasty that ruled over the kingdom of Khwarazm, or Khwarezmia, which lies south of the remnants of the Aral Sea around the modern border between Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan. He spent 2 years campaigning here to absorb the region into his fast-expanding realm. It was an important region through which the Amu Darya or Oxus River flows, a vital source of irrigation and farmland in an otherwise arid part of Central Asia. He then intervened in the ongoing strife within the White Horde, a component part of the Golden Horde, to ensure the accession of an ally named Toktamish as head thereof. With a friendly ruler now on his northern border, Timur was free to turn his attention southwards, and he spent the remainder of the 1370s and into the 1380s focusing on reducing the great cities of eastern Persia and western Afghanistan to his rule. By 1382, his emergence as the preeminent conqueror of Central Asia was becoming clear after his armies campaigned as far west as the Caspian Sea. His reputation for fearsome conduct and psychological warfare, like Genghis Khan had done a century and a half earlier, was also established during this period. When a rebellion broke out in Khorasan in the early 1380s, he punished the inhabitants of the town of Isfizar by taking 2,000 inhabitants prisoner and then ordering them to be cemented together alive in a giant tower of clay, brick, and human. Those who survived the grisly work presumably were left to starve to death, stuck within the makeshift masonry. His methods were brutal and effective. The city of Kandahar in Afghanistan fell to the Timurid host in 1384, completing the conquest of most of Afghanistan and Persia. No sooner was Kandahar in his possession than Timur began developing a more ambitious strategy to the west. In 1385, he set off on a campaign to the Middle East, passing beyond the southern end of the Caspian Sea for the first time. The size of the armies he employed in these campaigns was very large, though there are no accurate records with which to come up with precise numbers. It is usually assumed that Timur had over 100,000 men under his command at a given time in the 1380s and 1390s, and often much more. At the Battle of Ankara in 1402, for instance, he may have commanded as many as 140,000 men. Additionally, armies of this kind travelled with a huge amount of auxiliary staff and camp followers to keep them fed and found. Everything from people to provide huge amounts of fodder to keep the horses fed, to a considerable brigade of blacksmiths to mend weapons and other tools of war, followed in the train of Timur's host. This was the great army that he led into western Persia and Mesopotamia in 1386. He then turned north and rampaged through the Caucasus, seizing the city of Tbilisi in Georgia briefly, and even passing into Anatolia in what is now Turkey. The first campaign into the Middle East and the Caucasus would have ended in more substantial conquests had Timur not received word that his former ally Toktamish had taken advantage of his absence far to the west to rampage into Central Asia, threatening Timur's core territories.
Stupid man. I have not paused a whole lot because I am just fascinated with this guy. I just did the Ottoman video yesterday, I think. Yeah, yesterday. And so I started this yesterday. You know when you learn about someone new and you realize that they are probably a psychopath? That's kind of where I am with this guy. I mean, I know he buried people alive. He killed a couple people, that he had issues with. Sealed a bunch of others up in a tower. So, yeah. And I know how he dies. I looked that up because I was like, it had to be violent. No.
Timur had no option but to set off back eastwards to counter the threat. It would not be his last visit to the Middle East though, and when he returned, he would do so in ways which left a lasting memory. The threat that Toktamish and the invasion of the Timurid Empire by the armies of the Golden Horde posed was far from a negligible one. Timur's former ally had invaded Central Asia with a huge army which, if some of the chronicles are to be believed, numbered anywhere up to 250,000 men. This was clearly an exaggeration designed by writers who wanted to praise Timur's achievement in seeing off this threat. For several years, the two armies shadowed each other around Central Asia, until eventually Timur took the war to Tokhtamesh, invading Russia north of the Caspian and east of the Ural Mountains. The two enormous contingents met at the Battle of the Kondurcha River in what today is the Samara Oblast on the 18th of June 1391, after a 5-month march northwards by Timur. Despite being outnumbered, Timur's better-trained men, many of whom already had access to basic firearms that were only just becoming available in Europe, held the line better against the Golden Horde's efforts to outflank them. In the end, Tokhtamesh's ranks broke and fled. The Golden Horde was not defeated as a threat entirely in the long run. However, this was enough to end the immediate war, and with it, Timur was able to return to his long-held goal, to conquer the rich cities of the Middle East, above all, Baghdad, the capital of the old Arab Caliphate and the political center of the Muslim world. In 1392, Timur embarked on the 5-year campaign. It would be his most consequential of all his military campaigns. While many people are aware that Timur built an enormous empire in Central Asia and made incursions into the Middle East, the exact scale of his conquests and his odyssey into foreign lands is often underappreciated. The peak of this came during the 5-year campaign. By 1393, he had advanced well into the Middle East after forcing any recalcitrant elements within Persia to resubmit to him. He achieved one of his major aims quite easily that year, when Baghdad submitted to him without resistance after the ruler of the city, Sultan Ahmad Jalayir, fled in advance of his army arriving. Another expedition was launched into Georgia in the same year, one which continued through 1394, culminating the following year at the Battle of the Terek River in the North Caucasus between Timur and the Golden Horde forces of Tokhtamesh. Victory for Timur once again ensured that Tokhtamesh abandoned any efforts to wage war on the Central Asian Empire and no longer troubled Timur for the rest of his reign. To reinforce the message that he had comprehensively defeated the Golden Horde, Timur continued on north and rampaged into southwestern Russia, sacking several cities and towns as a warning to his rival. With this done, Timur returned back through the Caucasus to the Middle East, pacifying some of the more resistant elements amongst the Ak-Koyunlu and Kara-Koyunlu. Then he made for home, having campaigned as far as any other Central Asian power had into Europe and the Middle East in the 14th century. Cities and towns across these regions acknowledged Timur as their ruler, and his empire now stretched from Baghdad and other parts of the Middle East to the Himalayas. After the 5-year campaign came to an end, and Timur returned home late in 1396, he spent nearly 2 years in Samarkand, the longest spell he would spend in the city uninterrupted, a sign of how unrelenting his military campaigning was, even as he entered his 60s. These 2 years of respite from war provided an opportunity for him to oversee a program of cultural, artistic, construction and religious work, which have cumulatively been considered to constitute the beginning of the Timurid Renaissance. There were many layers to this. A building program was undertaken at Samarkand to begin erecting a number of monumental mosques and buildings. Schools were opened to promote the study of mathematics, philosophy, and other subjects which the scholars of Persia and Baghdad had been the greatest proponents of in the Middle Ages.
That's actually really good, getting kids to do math, and you're kind of trying to build up the future. That's pretty smart. I'm going to let it go for a little bit.
Classic art forms associated with Central Asia and China flourished. notably geometric art, rich rug and tapestry weaving, the carving of jade statues, and fine metalwork in gold and silver. The complex and colorful geometric...
We'll go back. We're going to go ahead and stop it there. Yeah, I want to dislike him, but I respect him. Anybody who can go on and you just basically secure an empire. That's impressive. I don't care who you are, especially in that day, and you've built up a name for yourself to where people know you and they flee when you're coming. I mean, he was no Genghis Khan, but I'd never heard of him, and I'm thinking that's kind of disrespectful. Doesn't mean we have to know about every single one, but he did a lot. All right, well, we're going to end this here. Like I say, we will be back with part 3, which will run to about the 51 minutes or so. But until then, hope you're enjoying. What do you know about him? Don't spoil it. Even though this video, all 4 of these will be done by the time I release them. But don't spoil anything for me. Spoil it for me, if you would. Tell me something that isn't in this video. Like, I know he was missing 2 fingers on one hand, right? So he was doing this a lot. Like, did he have like a kneecap? An extra kneecap? Did he have one nipple? Tell me. Come on. I want to know some good stuff. All right. Until next time, have a good day. Have a good night.